Well, good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Well, I'll tell you, it's an absolute tremendous honor to be here today with our distinguished panel. It'd be tough to find this group of professionals with their experience and what they've done for our nation anywhere in America. So the chance to actually have them with us today to hear from them is a tremendous honor, and I'd like to welcome everybody on behalf of General Raymond. So welcome today. A special welcome to our distinguished visitors that are here. Also our family and friends, quite a turnout. It's amazing. Everyone here seems to be loved. So, quite a turnout all the way around. So I guess in the end, that's probably our greatest accomplishment, if we can say that, right? A special welcome to our teammates from Air Force Space Command and the Joint Force Space Component Command that are here today to hear from our distinguished visitors, and especially our space and missile pioneers that have joined us today. So please give them a round of applause. This is an incredible event, as part of the lunch and induction ceremonies that were at the club. And it's not an event that is easy to put on. And so I'd just like to, have a recognition for our history office and protocol that are here today that put on such a class event. So please do. There's a saying that those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. And I twist that a little bit with who we have here today. With the rise of the great power competitors that are back again, I'd say we're here to learn from our pioneers so we can attempt to repeat it and what they did. Their accomplishments were not only significant, but they did so in the midst of the Cold War. And I don't think I'd be exaggerating to say that their accomplishments were a matter of national survival. And these gentlemen went toe-to-toe with the big bear in the Soviet Union and won. And there's much that we can learn from what they did as we approach the same environment today. They created and established the missionaries that are fundamental to our business. It's really eye-watering when you think about what they did and the areas and missionaries that they established. Reconnaissance satellites and technologies never existed before these gentlemen stepped in and created those. Missile warning capabilities, assured access to space, launch and range operations they brought to existence, space situational awareness, and the space catalog, and even an anti-satellite missile launched off an F-15, which is pretty cool, sir. I have to admit that's pretty cool. In short, we read a lot about history. These gentlemen made it. They made it, and often it's nice that the families are here to hear that, because much of what they did was in secrecy, and they couldn't talk about that for good reason. So it really is an honor to have them here today to talk about it. And many did so, which was remarkable, as lieutenants and captains, very junior officers in the Air Force at the time. And I think there's a lesson for all of us in that it's important to challenge our most junior professionals and personnel, trust them, and then get out of their way and let them go do great things. These gentlemen are bold, they're innovators, they're risk takers, and they know how to go fast. They had to. Our national survival counted on them going fast and accomplishing what they did. But most importantly, they're our heroes. And it's an honor to have them here with us today. It's an honor to learn from them, and it's an honor to attempt to carry on their legacy. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it back over to Dr. Rick and hear from them and not me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Colonel Manor. So welcome to the 2018 Space Heritage Week's Air Force Space and Missile Pioneer Panel. As you said, I'm Dr. Rick Sturdivant. I'm the senior historian here at Headquarters Air Force Space Command and Deputy Director of History. I've been with the command since April of 1985, so I've seen a few things come and go. Anyway, many of the programs, as Colonel Manor says, that we manage and support today go back to what these gentlemen did. Our space and missile pioneers are represented in the panel before you. They were directly responsible and significantly involved in the origins of the programs that we continue to operate today in one way or another. I would take exception to the fact that history repeats itself. It doesn't exactly do that, but I've always said it's sort of helical or elliptical. So it does come around in one way or another. These people, directly and indirectly, affect the missions that we do today in sort of a helical way, I would say. And that's the reason for today's roundtable. Let me begin by introducing these panelists. First, our 2018 recipients. Brigadier General retired Joseph Don Mirth. He served as project officer for all Midas, Samos, Gambit, and Gambit Cubed launches in the 1960s, and as the Air Force Space Shuttle Program Director in the 1970s. Those of you who were in attendance at the luncheon heard a lot more about General Mirth's accomplishments over the course of his career, and even after he retired from active duty. And I might say that's true of all of these gentlemen. They didn't, just because they hung up the uniform, say, well, goodbye to success and goodbye to space. They've kept at it in one way or another. Colonel retired Rob Roy oversaw activation of the first space launch complexes at Vandenberg Air Force Base, and he was involved in Midas launches at Cape Canaveral before that. He introduced processes to ensure orderly cross-subsystem checkout prior to the Corona and other launches in those early days. And our third honoree, Mr. William Bill Barker, worked for more than 50 years to introduce. He says it wasn't 50 years, but I think it was pretty close.
Well, it only seems that way.
To introduce typical improvements in the maintenance of the U.S. space catalog, from sequential processing to the astrodynamic support workstation and the high accuracy satellite drag model. And now I'd like to introduce some of our returning pioneers. First, we have Mr. John Herther at the far end. He was a 2003 honoree. Mr. Herther designed the three-axis stabilization systems that enabled Lockheed's Agena space vehicle, which General Mirth worked on, to become the Corona Reconnaissance Program's workhorse, and many of our other three-axis stabilized satellites, as a matter of fact. He also helped develop the technology to allow hundreds of other Air Force NASA payloads to orbit the Earth successfully. And then we have Major General retired Robert A. Rosie Rosenberg. He doesn't like me to call him General. He says I'm just Rosie. So forgive me if I don't refer to them by their ranks as we go with the roundtable here. I know all these gentlemen so well, having made every effort to get them in the Hall of Fame over the years. He served as mission controller and targeteer for Corona, Gambit, and Cygnet satellite programs, was directly responsible for the development and acquisition of advanced mission planning and the command and control software supporting the creation of the Hexagon program. As a member of the President's National Security Council, he assisted in the establishment of the Space Shuttle program, initial funding of the Global Positioning System, which wasn't an easy task, and formulation of President Carter's National Space Policy. Next to him is Major General retired Thomas D. Taverney, former recipient of the Air Force Scientific Achievement Award for developing and demonstrating a new guidance approach for the miniature homing vehicle, thereby allowing proof of concept for an air-launched anti-satellite weapon system. We'll hear a little more about that today. He also led numerous significant space payload developments, including the extremely successful commercially hosted infrared program, I'm sure some of you might have heard about. And finally, we have Colonel retired Wilbert Bill Craig III, 2006 honoree. Colonel Craig was a member of the original Air Force Space Surveillance Space Track Team and was chief analyst for the first operational anti-satellite system, Program 437. In the early 1970s, Colonel Craig led air staff planning for the incorporation of the space shuttle into military operations. So please join me in a round of applause for all of these panelists. Now that we've had the introductions over, I'd like to begin our mentoring session by asking some opening questions to first our new honorees, and then I'll ask one for all of the panelists, and then I'll try to turn it over to you. Now, I hope that you all are going to have questions by the time we get through this preliminary, But if you don't, believe me, I have plenty of additional questions for them. Before I ask the first question of the new honorees, I want to say that a reporter once asked Charlie Glossert, who also is one of our Air Force Space and Missile pioneers. You'll see his portrait on the wall outside in the lobby. For those of you who don't know, he was the father of the Atlas, ICBM, and Space Launch Vehicle. And so this reporter asked him, he said, you are constantly busy with the development of space travel. What is the appeal? And Charlie replied, it's the challenge. When we came up with the plans for the Atlas rocket, there was hardly anyone who believed it could be created. But we proved it could be done. Something like that makes a man very happy. Now we have even bigger plans. And progress never stops. So the first question that I'd like to ask, and we'll, I think start with General Murth, is describe one of the significant challenges that you confronted during your career, and how did you manage to resolve it or not?
I guess the biggest challenge in my career was, can you hear me? Yes, sir. Yeah, was being the shuttle program director. We had to work with NASA, very closely with NASA, because NASA, of course, had the responsibility for the vehicle. And we were building a launch site out on the West Coast, and with not only the launch site, the launch pad, but 7 other facilities with it. And this place was enormous. It was huge. And we started out, before I got there, the original RFP, they were going to put out a request for proposal. They estimated that, NASA came in and estimated that we were going to have maybe 200 changes per month. And the guys that put out the RFP changed that to 500 changes per month. And they went ahead and they bid on it. And then once we got the program going, we wound up with 1,500 changes per month. And those 1,500 changes per month were affecting this enormous hardware, the launch mount, the launch pad, and all of the facilities. And the way we solved that was to bring more money. We actually had to increase the size of the contract substantially, because it was 1,500 changes a month. It's just something that you can hardly digest. And we went forward and made the proper proposals and so on to increase the funding for the program, and we're able to do that.
Okay, Colonel Roy, you're next. What was one of the most significant challenges you confronted, and how did you go about either solving it or not? You know, sometimes we don't always solve our challenges.
Well, I wasn't an engineer designer for my hardest problem. It occurred in the launch area. Prior to Vandenberg, most of everything that had been done at Patrick and elsewhere was controlled by a single contractor. You had the Beaumont, the Snark, the Matador, and you had a prime contractor who was designed and ran the whole show. When we got to Vandenberg, we were so highly classified that nobody seemed to know anything about what was going on. And as you can imagine, a whole bunch of different contractors not knowing the main objective of a program, there was a little bit of interaction between the companies. So the biggest problem I faced with then was, since they had appointed a military launch controller, someone who was going to integrate together the propulsion, the guidance, the warhead, the payload, everything else, was to try and get people to work together, to get them to cooperate when they had to share with someone else, when they had to come up with innovative ideas and they didn't know everything about everything. And it was a really task that required something that I was not really talented in at the time, and it was diplomacy, so I had to learn that. But it was a pleasure to actually start and get together with the different contractors when you could talk to them and begin to get them to understand what you were doing and that it was important, and you were working in the benefits of national defense. And if you got a few people on your side, it became contagious. And sooner than we thought, people started to work together. We started to write procedures which integrated many different companies, which is a very neat talent. And things started to get to the point where we could run a missile launch countdown with 5 or 6 different contractors, and none of them knowing really what the payload was. I think my biggest solution was having patience, learning to work with contractors, learning to be a partner, not a manager. And that's something I think we need to keep in mind as the problems get bigger and bigger and more complex.
Rick?
Mr. Parker, what about your challenge?
Rick, can I make a comment?
We'll let you make a comment. I don't want to get too far off from having Bill Parker.
Okay.
But no, go ahead.
Go ahead.
There's a lot of give and take here.
You know, it was really interesting because we'd have a blockhouse full of people, and there might be only 5 or 10 people in the blockhouse that knew what the payload was. So we'd have separated rooms in some of the blockhouses, and one guy on one side of the wall would be working on the payload, and the other guy on the other side of the wall would be working on the booster part of the rocket. And these 2 guys actually lived next door to each other in Santa Maria. And the guy on the unclassified side never knew that the other guy was there right next to him.
If I recall the story, you brought those folks in on different buses.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Mr. Parker, what about your challenge?
For those of you who were at the luncheon, you were told that what I'm sitting here for is the development of the Air Force's high accuracy catalog. I've spent the last 30 or 40 years in one form or another working on and developing. The greatest challenge that I had during that whole time was lack of funding and equipment to do research and development on. It seems like every time we had a new system come along, it was a huge multi-billion dollar or multi-million dollar in the early days project. And the computers that we were running on in those days were huge mainframe machines. They required all kinds of air conditioning and power and whatnot. And they only bought, the Air Force only bought a few of them because they were so expensive. And so there was no machine to do technical analysis and development on to try to improve the astrodynamics and improve the algorithms. As a result, it appeared that every time we had a big new project to build a new system, what we really got was the old system rehosted on some different hardware, and sometimes with a program language change. And that nothing much was done to improve accuracy or add new applications. I want to tell you a story about the first machine. No, let me back up a little. once we had the new high-speed workstations, the first ones we had were from a company called Silicon Graphics. And before that, even the mini computers that came along, that were a lot less expensive. We started getting some of the equipment we needed to do research and development on and try to improve things. The first machine where we first stood up a high accuracy catalog, we obtained from Mr. Bill Craig. And it turns out I was working for a company called Command Sciences Corporation at the time, and Bill was trying to help us get the equipment we needed to stand up a high accuracy catalog. And it turns out that the machine was in the back of his Ford Explorer. And he has never fessed up to me where he obtained it, and I never asked. And he probably wouldn't tell me anyway. So anyway, in the Command Sciences building over there off of Fountain, we plugged that in. I finally got the management at Command Sciences to give us a room, and we plugged it in, and we started getting data, pulling data on tape down from Cheyenne Mountain, and building a prototype for the first system that was used to do collision assessment for the space station and the shuttle that was flying at that time. So that's how the whole thing started. By that time, of course, we were off of the cards that I talked about over at the luncheon. Some lessons learned. In the future, I think, we need to provide equipment and funding for R&D. We got to do that. We got to have a separate dedicated computer system that the young people that are coming along, young engineers and scientists, that they can get on that machine, have a dedicated database, and be able to improve things. That's what it's all about, is doing the R&D to improve things. And that's what my career has been about, to try to do that. Migrate existing computer code that works. Don't recode just for the sake of recoding. So many times we have decided a new programming language would solve all of our problems. It doesn't work that way. What happens is you get people who don't maybe have the corporate knowledge coding algorithms that have been around for a while, but they introduce new bugs, and it takes time to sort all of that out and finally make things work again. The way we built the astrodynamic support workstation, I think the computer scientists today would call kind of a spiral development. We coded a little, we prototyped, we tested a lot, and then implemented. And that's what I think, the way I think systems ought to be built. That's all I have.
Okay, I'm curious, we probably aren't going to get a confession, but I'd like to know, Bill, where you got that equipment that was in the back of your Ford Explorer.
Ours is not as neat you than ours.
Okay, I thought I did answer something like that.
It was a state-of-the-art machine at the time. It was a DEC Alpha, 4 processors, and we used it for probably, 15 years. It was a great piece of equipment.
Okay, now I'm gonna put Colonel Craig on the spot here, along with General Taverny, I think, and possibly some others who were involved in some of this. But my question is going to be, there's a growing concern today about space being a contested domain, one in which adversaries pose a threat to U.S. satellites. I would dare say I know enough history that yes, space is becoming more contested, but that leaves a lot of naive people out there in the general public with the notion that it wasn't contested decades ago. You gentlemen and I, as a space historian, know differently. Some of you, including Colonel Craig and General Taverny and a couple of others, played significant roles in earlier Air Force programs to counter hostile space threats, the ASAT weapons. And some of you are currently conceptualizing how we might deal with such threats now and in the future. Could you please share your experience and wisdom regarding those programs and what we might learn from them today?
I see Colonel Craig pointing at me, but he's the start of this, so he really has to start. I actually, kind of a smooth flow. You know, he was involved in the early days of it, and I kind of got involved after the cancellation of 437, so you need to start, sir.
I have some notes up here because Ray could get mad if I didn't. We have to contain ourselves because these programs have all been so much fun. You all understand the threat to our critical space systems. We lost GPS, we lost the surveillance systems, reconnaissance systems, the communication systems. We would be out of business militarily. And our civilian, our non-military world would start crumbling too. We have a real problem now in a growing space threat and our ability to deal with it. So early on, we had the Air Force Saint program, which I refer to as the Boy Scout knife of anti-satellite systems. You would intercept, inspect, if worse came to worse, on phase 3, you would destroy. And fortunately, the program was so far out of scope fiscally that Secretary McNamara decided after 5 years that it would be canceled. Now, at the same time, we decided that we'd have a Nike Zeus program developed by the Army at Kwajalein, and this was nuclear, 400 megaton weapon, and a ballistically guided missile. And that program was canceled. Actually, it was put on backup after they decided that the targets that it would go after were too far away, couldn't go high enough, couldn't go wide enough, and would take too long to have the Earth rotate in a targeted line. So we came up with a program 437. Now, 505 program I was just discussing was the first official deployed anti-satellite system in the world. The second one, as far as we know, was 437. Now, there was an interesting system in that we ran it from Colorado Springs, and we fired the anti-satellites from Johnston Island, sort of in real time. Now, this was a McNamara decision. Excuse me. Here's what we did. First, the anti-satellite system was a Thor IRBM, such as we used with Corona, and we'd used 2 of them, 2 pads at Johnston Island, and they had Athena computers controlling, and they would fly straight up, direct descent, until burnout, and then they would go ballistic, and we would pick a target satellite, an old payload or whatever, and we had camera, a beacon on camera at Sand Island, a couple miles off the coast of Johnston Island, and they would score the miss. And the warhead we used was a W-49. Would use, we didn't actually ever use it, but we simulated a W-49, 1.4 megaton warhead. So the kill radius, which was probably pessimistic, was about 8 kilometers. So all we had to do was get the missile within 8 kilometers of the target we picked. Now, back to Colorado Springs. NORAD Space Track got the mission. And Samsung didn't like it too well, but that's the way it worked. And so this was our first operational space mission in the attack sense. We computed very accurate orbits. Samsung sent TRW-STL out to help us. Turned out we had to help them. They didn't know about any satellites that didn't communicate. And then we practiced on satellites that didn't talk to us. Detect, track, identify, and catalog all objects in space, most of which don't talk back. So they didn't know what sensors were, the kind we used, EMUs, spacer, FPS 49 radars and whatnot. Didn't know what those were. So they thought their special perturbations program would be good. It was traced, but it was repackaged by ESD and Hanscom into something called SPOD, Electronic Systems Precision Orbit Determination. Well, we had a program called Spiral Decay, which Bill Barker knows about, we adapted that program to the guidance parameters we needed for the Athena computers out at Kwajalein. And turns out our spiral decay was about 10 times as fast and 3 or 4 times as accurate. So we said bye-bye, and we took it over ourselves. Now, so we would compute orbits until we got refinement, and then we'd use those IBM cards, like Bill asked, and we had 7 or 9, depending on what we were doing. And we would keep generating orbits as new data came in. And we together with the orbits, we developed the guidance parameters for the Thors. So we had a compound terminal. We had a good set of orbital elements and guidance parameters. We would set the cars, these, into a compound terminal, send them real time to the Athena computers, and they start counting down, and away we go. So now, consider that satellites are traveling 7 kilometers a second or so, which means you have to have accuracies within a second or you don't meet that 8 kilometer radius. So we did that. We had 10 tests, 9 of them were successful. 1 failed because we didn't meet the envelope. And 1 came so close that we thought we'd hit the doggone satellite target ballistically. And I was thinking that China 2007, we might have beat them. We might have been ahead of them with space debris because the target altitude, I think, was about 700 kilometers. So that system was operational in 1982. It stayed operational until 1962. Stayed operational until 1970, where it went on standby. And it still had 2 Thors on the pad. By the way, we would count down 30 seconds, hot shadow, and then decide which Thor was going to go. So it was a real-time operational system. Now, 1970, we went on standby between 70 and 75, and at 75, the program was canceled. An interesting thing led up to cancellation. Of course, nobody liked to handle nuclear weapons, and that was just part of it. But we'd done in 58 through 62, we'd done high-altitude nuclear tests. And there, we discovered what you all know, EMP is bad. And there's a long reach when you have big weapons. So, also, you mess up everybody's electronics, and you kill satellites. We actually killed half of the current operational force in one of the tests. Anyway, it was a bad deal. So nuclear warheads didn't look too good. Anyway, we went from time passes, went from Washington, a group of us with the Secretary of the Air Force, who was also director of the NRO, out to Colorado Springs in 1974. And they were briefing, beautiful briefing, and they came to 437, whereupon Dr. McLucas said, "Stop! I told you guys to get rid of that a year ago." Dead silence. And the next year was formally canceled. So that was the last formal anti-satellite program deployed that the United States had.
Okay, but then along came another test in the 1980s. In fact, about the time I arrived here and started writing history, we had the F-15 air-launched ASAT test with the control center in Cheyenne Mountain. Jim Tappan, I think you were involved in some of that.
Well, it started, so following the 437 going to standby, the issue was the nuclear part of it. They just didn't like the idea of putting nuclear weapons in space. So they said, can we come up with a non-nuclear version? The first version they looked at was called DSDD, Defense something, I forget. But Colonel Diedrich was in charge of that, and the idea was to fly the same Thor rockets, put 180-gram rods in it, a whole array of 180-gram rods, shoot it up, deploy those rods, and hope your satellite flew through it. They were funded for 3 tests. They flew 2. The sensor failed on the first one. The sensor operated on the second one, and they decided it was too complicated. So about 1969, the Army we had been working on ballistic missile defense systems using a miniature homing vehicle. And so the Army got the mission. We had no more use for this miniature homing vehicle that we invested a lot in. And so one night, actually in Colorado Springs at a restaurant called Three Thieves down the road, doesn't exist anymore, a guy named Joe Suya and I sat, we were lamenting the loss of the program we loved. And I remembered a program called RPAT, which was another ballistic missile defense, flying an interceptor on an aircraft. And I said, well, what if we do this on an aircraft? He was stationed out here at Wasn't Space Command and at NORAD, and I was stationed in LA. And so I said, I think I can come up with a design. So we did a design using a miniature homing vehicle on a standard arm. Since this was 69, it was long before SRAMs and F-15s existed. So it was an F-106 on a standard arm missile. And so we took that up scarily to NORAD, and the commander was a General McGee. On his wall, he had a missile man badge, which I had in my pocket, and it said, "This is the tombstone of an American pilot." And so I was scared to death to go in that office with my missile man badge off. I was trying to get it off before I went in, but I didn't. But they loved the idea because it was an airborne way of solving the missile problem with non-nuclear means. So we had to go through a lot of, there are a lot of people that didn't believe the technology was feasible. We worked with 14th Air Force on uploading the commanding, and they just didn't believe. In fact, in one of the offices I was in, they said, you can't put this 1,400-pound missile on a F-106. And I said, it carries a 2,800-pound tip tank normally, so why do you think not? So they said, you're not a pilot, get out of my office. So, but after a while, it took a long time to get funded, and ended up being an F-15 and a SRAM missile, and it was demonstrated in 1984. But the underlying thing that is the most important element to this is that the Russians were continually testing. In 1969, they did their first co-orbital test. They were proving that they could do co-orbital, non-nuclear satellite intercept, and all that time, too, China was shining lasers on the systems we love, Gambit and Hexagon, trying to damage the optics. And so, while we were the victim of significant politics about us having what the administration called, non-symmetrical activities, our adversaries were actively using their systems and testing their systems, but it was all classified. We couldn't say anything about it. So, that was always a problem in that our adversaries would get ahead of us, as we see today. They do it in a secure environment. We're not allowed to talk about it, so it's hard to advocate for the programs to catch up to them. And I think that's a problem you all see today.
I think Chairman Rosenberg has something to say.
Yeah, I want to talk about the first problem and then the solution. First problem is when I was working for President Carter, I was the intelligence and space weenie on the National Security Council staff. My colleagues all thought they were very close. I said, we're nothing but White House weenies. And at any rate, I had written President Carter's national space policy, working with all of the departments and agencies who were involved in space. And he signed something called Presidential Directive 37. A couple of days later, my boss, Zbigniew Brzezinski, called me and said, Secretary of State told the President he should fire you because you got him to sign a classified annex for weapons of mass destruction in space. It was the F-15 ASAT. So I called in Tempo Vought, the integrating contractor, and I said, I want a 5-chart briefing. No engineers anywhere near it, just cartoonists. And the first one is a smiling brick with Mercury wings and big eyes. And the second one is an F-15 launching the ASAT. And the third one is the ASAT crashing through a satellite. And I want a full-scale mock-up built of this payload with, 36 mouse-farting rockets around the side.
It was like a can with
Yeah.
rockets around it, right?
And IR sensors. And I called Harold Brown, Secretary of Defense, and I said, Mr. Secretary, I got to go explain to the President that this is not a weapon of mass destruction. I need you there with me. So we go in to the President's office, and I start going through the charts, and he sees this full-scale mock-up. He goes over to it, he says, Harold, this is really neat. We need one of these. And I said, Boss, this is what your Secretary of State said you should fire me over. It's a weapon of mass destruction. He says, oh no, Harold, we need one of these. Now, I had supported it. You'll note that Tav said he thought he might be in trouble because it was a missile. And my Air Force never wanted to waste any money on this space garbage. And I figured if we could launch it on an F-15, it would give the useless pilots something to do for a living. Okay, so that was the problem. President Carter did approve the program. Later, my Air Force helped cancel it. But what's the solution to the problem today? The solution to the problem today is we got to stop being space cadets. We got to stop wanting to do things differently. Now, many, many years ago, we started arming our airplanes with defense systems. We put defensive radars on our airplanes. And we then, when the enemy started coming toward us, we would throw out chaff and flares and electronic countermeasures. And if the guy kept coming after us anyway, we'd shoot and kill him. And what we need to do is stop being space cadets and spending lots and lots of money on great big satellites invented by people who would rather make big satellites than earn a living properly. That what we need to do is adopt the air power example of making our technology such that SPOs can't say, you can't do that, Rosie, because it'll cause a block change. We ought to be able to make the technology for defensive systems the equivalent in space of countermeasures, chaff, flares, and a defensive weapon to kill him when he keeps coming anyway. That's my solution to the problem. As well as cyber warfare. They can get into our satellites today because we don't understand how to defend them against cyber warfare.
Now, that should have generated some questions in your mind. So, I'm ready to entertain questions from the audience. If there are any.
Just for the panel in general, it sounds,
Oh, you have to.
Stand up, Mondo.
Oh, this is gonna be.
That way everybody can hear. Some of us up here on stage are getting a little hard of hearing.
I can talk loud enough if you're worried about recording it. I work for a National Space Defense, one of the orbital analysts out there. I just wondered, with your experience and the things you've seen, I sometimes feel, I've been in this for about 25 years, so I sometimes feel like we've come full circle back in a lot of things. What's your perception of where we are, and are we making the same kinds of mistakes that we made in the past and not moving out on things that we should be moving out on?
That's a loaded question.
Well, I don't want to be repetitious, I don't want to be repetitious, but yeah, I think we're repeating the same stupid mistakes we made back in the beginning. The fact is, you know, when Rob and Don and I were there at the birth of the National Reconnaissance Program, we did not belong to any military department. Now, when you build tanks and when you build fighter planes, they belong to the Army, they belong to the Air Force, and they build in defense into their system. Well, we sought peaceful use of outer space, and the military departments look forward to not spending any money on defending space systems, and they hid behind this nonsense of peaceful use of outer space. And again, we've got to get over that, and we've got to recognize that space is no longer peaceful use of outer space. And we've got to start spending defensive capability as well as offensive capability like I talked about.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'd say it's necessarily a common mistake, but it is a common conundrum we have in that we are reactionary. And we're reactionary because whenever we try to be proactive, Congress and the staffs up there say, well, why are you doing that? It's not a program of record. We don't see the threat. And so when you try to be forward-looking and say, geez, they're going to have hypersonic vehicles, now we're surprised by it, right? And we need to do something to defend against them, they say, well, where did you get that threat? It's not in the program of record. So, and I think that's always been the issue, is that it's a difficult world for proactive, visionary people to make a difference unless your commander has a budget. The advantage the NRO had is it had one clump budget, right? And so if you saw, you had a visionary thing for something that wasn't in whatever the program of record is, you got to do it. So the NRO got to do a lot of innovative things, but they had a situation that allowed them to do it. Your conundrum was the same conundrum the regular Air Force already had, is that visionaries always struggle because a thing that your vision is hasn't occurred yet. And that's the only way you stay ahead of these things. You know, we should have had defensive systems against hyperglide weapons 10 years ago. There were people thinking about it and talking about it. But whoever would raise that issue, they'd say, no threat, get out of the room, not program of record. So, yeah, I think we repeat the mistakes. And I think one of the things we all hope is this thing called Space Force. Whether it's Space Force, Space Corps, or just giving a budget to the right location, allows some flexibility to look at those innovative, forward-looking things that aren't in programs of record.
I totally agree with prior speakers. I had RDT&E in the Pentagon for various programs, including some of the space programs. And a couple of the programs that are going online or have been online for just a couple of years were planned in effect by the space surveillance of objects in space in the 1970s, SOS 70 study, which was Air Force-wide, run by Dr. Bob Nockup, and one of the space pioneers. And in that, we decided we had to basically start transitioning space surveillance from ground systems to space. And in 1980, early 1980s, 79, 1980, we had a couple of the systems I've just been talking about, and we had them ready to go in 1986, ready to go, ready to bend metal, solder, and get on the road. Those systems, 1986, count the years, how long it took. And why? Because of bureaucratic foot dragging, people had different ideas, you have to go re-look at everything. And I think one of the advantages, of course, of the NRO was the ability to avoid bureaucracy. And one of the rules is don't over-communicate with our headquarters. That's one of the battles.
What are battles rules, right?
So, and one of the problems overall with space has been a lack of solid constituency. And you got the politics, and Congress is going to have to pay attention to their constituents. But you have to have a constituency, an overall agreement. This is what we need to do. Now, in line with what was just said, basically we might have to have a national emergency to get us up and running. And we're reactive as opposed to proactive. We can't plan ahead in anticipation. We have to wait until we got everything written on gold tablets and revisited every 5 years. So things don't happen unless there's an emergency right now.
That sort of seems to be a pattern throughout American history, not just Air Force Space history, as a matter of fact. I don't know, something about we Americans, we wait until we have a crisis on hand and then we try to solve it, rather than anticipating the crisis and solving it before it happens to us. It goes all the way back to the Revolution before, actually. So, Jack, did you have something you wanted
Yeah,
to
I
say?
have a comment on just what we're talking about.
She's button.
That the idea that you have to really see the effects of something to believe it, to get it off the dime. And I've got a little thing that's something like Battle's Laws. It's general things that I got out of the space program.
Can you tell
That's
us tell us what Battle's Laws, he's referring to
Battle's Laws are typical things. I worked under Lee Battle on he handled the GINA, and I was working on the payload as one of the camera contractors. That was a recovery contractor and a Lockheed group that tied that together. But Lee Battle ran that very much like our friend Rosie did. I think they must be related because he was a tough guy to work for. I never had any problem with him, but he had laws that the most famous one is don't illuminate your higher-ups any more than you have to. And that's the sort of thing that I remember. There's a bunch of them. I have three examples of a thing I call synergy, which are Draper's laws. Not Draper. I learned this before the Air Force, and I think I applied them in the Air Force, and I'm going to throw them out there. They're not just. I'll give you a copy of Draper's laws. Can I do that? Okay, in 1953, I graduated from Tennessee State, got my commission, and a colonel there, since I had founded a drill team, he said he had heard the Korean War was still on. He said he'd heard they're having trouble filling some of the graduate programs because you had to be in 3 years to even apply to one. So why don't you throw your name in? I did. I didn't get it. I went to work for Lockheed. But at the last minute, a week before Labor Day, they said, go to MIT, you're in. That was the luckiest break I ever had. I got 21 months at MIT. I owed them 3 years to pay back, but I owed them 2 anyway. It was a giving it away. It was great. The Air Force invested in me. That was 65 years ago, and the payback continues even today. The program of my military reconnaissance satellite guidance and control topic that I did at MIT in the second year changed the trajectory of space, at least the Air Force space, in my entire career. MIT had studied under Doc, now known as Draper Labs. It's independent of MIT. And I want to share some of the wisdom he taught me. There were 3 little platitudes that seemed ridiculous at the time. I'm not quoting them exactly, but many problems considered are almost impossible, but they are solvable with a can-do attitude and persistence. That's a good thing to kind of keep in mind. But you must get the physics and the geometry correct, then it will work. That's a little orbital thing that you got to have in mind. Now, the word I want to use, that I've used, is synergism. And that is seldom heard today, but he taught it, and we did examples of synergism, and he defined it when you're problem solving, trying to do some of the things you guys are going to be doing in the future to change the Space Force. If there are two alternatives, and they seem to have a solution potential, different characteristics, then you consider combining them by integration them properly. Spend the time. In fact, he used to quote an old Abe Lincoln saying that when you got to chop a bunch of logs, spend 9 hours sharpening the damn axe and then cut them, which is absurd, but it's easy to remember. And Doc always guaranteed that synergism will always be better than either alternative. That was just a given. And I'm going to give you 3 examples, and one of which indicates that if you have something in time, you really got to wring it out to get through the paper mill to get it implemented. This is an example in World War II. The Navy this is the Mark 14 gun sight that was on all the Navy ships. And prior to World War II, Doc, who was interested, because he was a private pilot, in developing an artificial horizon. So he became familiar with gyros and what they did and the physics of them. And he claims he spent 20 years as a student because he was never trained as an engineer. He learned all that afterwards. He was trained as a psychologist. He knew how to lead people and convince people of things, and he was a good people person. But anyway, what he found was that he's now known as the father of inertial guidance, among other things. He had become aware that the Navy used optically tracked gun sights going in like this for aircraft passing, attacking aircraft. He added a rate gyro and a range, and then he computed the lead, and with the range he knew that there was an additional height. And what the normal gunners did was shoot tracer bullets following an aircraft, and they just raised the aircraft. If the aircraft was higher or further out, they would raise it. And that was the total system for defending all the damn ships. He added those and later he modified it to kamikaze pilot attacks. And unfortunately, the Navy realized this very late. He was not believed in the Pacific theater. Early battle losses proved the Mark 14 ineffective. So the Navy started a QRC program, built 42,000 of them, that's very build them, and then began an installation. This was a synergy solution. And but there was actually 71 ships sunk or so badly damaged that were not repairable, and 150 more that were badly damaged that couldn't be repaired through the entire war. So there was 220 ships, and that's the unfortunate part, sadly. 6,600 sailors were killed, 8,000 wounded before this fix was fully deployed fleet-wide. So Doc, I knew him, his reputation was a sort of a figure of speech. He saved the Navy in the Pacific and all that. I didn't until just a few weeks ago. In 1990, there's a reference to it, and I got all these numbers, that reference. I just knew it in general. Maybe it's a couple ships. That's a significant portion of a fleet. You know, it's ridiculous. So that's one point. So the idea on 170, now after that, I went through the course, the 21 months. The last year we had to do a thesis. I started on a thesis doing the follow-on to that Navy Mark 14 example because they found that they lost some of them even with Doc's system. They wanted to track through Zenith, so if they didn't get them coming in, they'd get them coming out before they turned back. So I worked several months on that and was having so much hardware problems, I wanted something theoretical. the Air Force had just given a contract to study the Advanced Reconnaissance System. Three of us did thesis on it. Doc assigned us to write that. So we worked that year, then one of the things we did with other centers with specialties, we selected Lockheed as the prime contractor for a weapon system contract, which went on for decades. And then I was given a briefing on the status of that. I was in my latter period of owing the payback, and I briefed the Killian Committee, which was Dean Land was there, it was at WDD, we summarized the status of 117. Rand came up with the number that because of downlinks, there were only 9 by 9 pieces of film a day coming out of it. That's not enough. So they wanted to get a recovery system because nose cones had been approved. The idea of putting film in, let's bring that back. Film is a lot better resolution, and furthermore, we don't have to last for months or a fraction of a year and fly at 300 miles to get constant daylight. We're just going to be up a few days and do it. And we want to fly at 90 miles, not 300. So that was the design criteria for Corona. So we briefed it, and they pulled me out of the Air Force. I got a job with Leghorn, who had originally flown B-38s over pre-D-Day right on the deck. So he was a reconnaissance, he had a name in it, and he hired me. And when I got to Boston, by Christmas, we had already figured out that he wanted me to design a stabilization system that would work way down there, so gravity won't work. Midas, Samos, all that was way up there, 300 miles. So we had to do something otherwise, and it was a type of camera that painted the film that was scanning on with a lens on it. But that's a big torque. And on all the other missions, we had to stabilize everything with momentum balancing, pure physics. This had to be a big deal, a lot bigger deal. We did that design, briefed it to essentially Dick Bissell, who did the U-2 program. And before that, he'd been working with the CIA and the Marshall Plan, so he had a good reputation in high levels of government. He had a meeting once a month. We had meetings from Lockheed, GE, and us. Problems would come up, and that's where the idea of flying, every month we're going to fly. We're either paying them at Vandenberg to do their volleyball, or they may as well be flying. That was the facetious remark, that why you flew every month. So you flew, you took a week to figure out, to guess what was wrong. Next week to fix it, next week to check it out, next week they flew a flag. That was how I used some of the synergism, because the synergism was correcting with the horizon scanner. That's what made it doable. The scanner that was only designed for a precise orbit on ascent was used for a continuous vertical to a 10th degree. And that's what gave you good pictures straight down, which later evolved into the mapping camera and the GPS coordinates. You wouldn't have had them for transit or GPS, because Corona was used until the 1996 time period. That was the only source for Earth coordinates. And I'm sorry, I'm over 3 minutes.
And if you don't, you stop and think about it. You know, we've got some young troops out there. This guy was a second lieutenant, working on a degree, and he comes up with the idea of 3-axis stabilization. And it worked, not just for Corona. How do you think our advanced EHF satellites, our WGS satellites, how do you think all of those things, you know, our GPS satellites, how do you think they're stabilized so that they continue to look down on the Earth and not look somewhere where they could do nothing? It's 3-axis stabilization, and I think about the only large major system that wasn't 3-axis stabilized was the Defense Support Program satellite, which was spin stabilized. But all the rest of these systems depend on some of the work that Jack Ritter came up with. Jeff Paulson and I was working on it as well. But it's a seminal idea to our business.
One other point
based on this.
One other point. I got out of the space business, but went into ship collision avoidance. And we had to improve the accuracy, not only of avoiding collisions, but the accuracy of staying in channels. And GPS near land wasn't that good necessarily. So we used LORAN, which was a land-based system, and we corrected it. We combined transit satellite, the Navy satellite, with LORAN. We got 100 meters or less accuracy, which GPS didn't receive until 20 years later. 10 years later, it was used as the backup in Desert Storm for the same reason. So that the same thing was paying off, you know, in other ways. And it was synergy that I'm talking about, combining one or two things. I just saw recently that the PNT group has said there's been a new approval on LORAN as a backup, ELORAN as a backup to modern LORAN. That's enough, sorry.
General Mercer, did you have a comment?
Yeah, it's in response to the question, but it appears to me that over the years we have unlearned a lot of things that we learned in the early days. And we need to relearn those things, and I think that you're in the process of doing it. And just from the operations, the launch operations standpoint, let me give you a good example. But first of all, those of you that were not at the luncheon today, the general got up and quoted some numbers. And at Vandenberg in the 1964-1965 time frame, in that 1 year, and it was over a period of 4 or 5 years that we did this, but we launched over 40 space missions from Vandenberg alone, a total, with all of the SAC launches and so on, of around 115 launches. Yeah. Can you do that today? Not even close. And we've unlearned how to do that. It appears to me that we're not looking for real workarounds and how to get things done. I'm going to give you one example. I had a bird on, and Rob had it on the pad, and I was told, it was a Midas bird, and I was told that there was a Corona, and I knew it was over there, but Corona had the priority, and I could not launch. Rob couldn't go ahead and launch until the Corona went. Well, the problem with that was that the Midas had a hard cutoff date. And they said, if you don't launch by this date, you're going to have to demate the Agena, and we're going to have to take it back and purge the tanks and so on. And we pushed it right to the limit, and that was a real hard cutoff date. Well, here's Corona with the priority, and Rob's ready to go, and we've got to wait for him. So we waited, and sure enough, the next thing he announces that his date is our hard cutoff date. So that means if we don't do something really extraordinary, we're going to wind up demating that vehicle, which we absolutely do not want to do. So I called Rob and I said, can you run a countdown simultaneously with Lefty, was the launch controller on the Corona. I said, can you run a countdown simultaneously with Lefty? And Rob looked at it and he came back and said, we can do it. I said, okay, now I got to get the range and the satellite control facility on board. And I sat there with Rob on the line and we negotiated for 4 hours at least. And every time they came in and they said, we can't do it because of this, we tried to figure out a workaround. And in that, like 4 hours, they finally came around and said, both of them, both the satellite control facility and the range, both came in and said, yeah, we'll support you. So you got 2 orbiting satellites, a Corona and a Midas, on the same day. Within 4 hours of each other, we launched them. And we did that a couple more times. Can you do that today? Absolutely not. You know, within the last 5 years, the DO at Patrick, and I live in that area, the DO announced that they were going to have a very busy year. They were going to have 10 launches. And currently, you're changing that, I know, you're changing it to about 40. I don't know what the range limitation is, but before, in the last couple of years, it used to be, it took 48 hours for a turnaround. 48 hours for a turnaround. You'd launch a shuttle and you couldn't go for 2 more days. And like I said, in 1963, we did it in 4 hours. So something's gone wrong, because every single range upgrade that we have had, one of the criteria, or one of the rationale, one of the arguments for that range upgrade was decreased turnaround time, and it went the other way. And you really need to work on that, because if you're talking about defense, satellite defense and so on, you're going to have to be quick response. It's not going to be something where you can sit there and wait for 48 hours for the bureaucracy to turn.
Dr. Spires, you have a question?
Along the lines of what General Murph was saying, along the lines of what you were saying, General Murph, question for General Taft.
Can't hear you, Dave.
especially. Pardon me?
Can't hear you.
If not, I can repeat it.
Not working. I can talk loud.
Yes. He was a professor, so he can.
Along the lines of what you were talking about, I'd like to ask General Taverty to comment on the variations of operationally responsive space and disaggregation along these lines of being more responsive.
That's a subject that might take too much of Pat's time. But quite frankly, turning around launches is something that's a matter of will rather than capability. When we were doing EELV, I mean, one of the things I briefed is we have the option for a small investment of buying a rolling booster of turning our response time of 2 years. That's another thing General Murph would love to hear, is that when you decide you want to launch, you're 2 years away from having a booster. So if we can get some rolling boosters in there, we can turn, and we have turned at the Cape. We haven't done it at Vandenberg because we haven't had a need, but we did turn launches back in 2004 and 5 in 24 hours. Take some waivers and stuff, but physically we can do it. It's a matter of will, it's a matter of budget, and it's a matter of your willingness to launch a rocket with another on the pad. I mean, the theory's always been the NRO doesn't like their rocket on the pad when someone else launches in case it crashes and hits them. So, you know, it's a matter of risk and all. So it isn't a matter of capacity, it's a matter of will and money. You know, the issues with disaggregation, you know, we're going back to the beginning. You know, Rosie can take you back to the beginning when we were building things fast in an innovative way. One of the reasons we could crash 13 Coronas is that we had another Corona ready to go. You know, we're building things fast because we were more risk tolerant. We had fewer reviews. Quite frankly, in those days, space wasn't as visible to Congress, wasn't as visible to leaders, and we didn't build up all the review or antibodies that exist. So in those days, you could kind of make decisions and turn things fast. And there are some things, like at ORS, we can. You know, ORS-1 launched in 24 months. You know, Chirp launched in 30 months. And they're all doable things, but again, it's a matter of will, policy, and I know the Air Force usually takes the heat for these things not happening. And the problem is the Air Force can only operate within the box of rules that's given. When you're given a bad box of rules, you can't get out of that box of rules, no matter how clever you are. And, you know, the people that we had that changed that, there always were a box of rules, but, you know, the people on this panel, you know, I grew up hearing stories about Rosie, and how Rosie the box was just a challenge to Rosie, that he lived outside the box, and if it was inside the box, it wasn't very interesting to him. So, we were encouraged in, follow the Rosie example, get out of the box and make things different. But I don't think any of these things are impossible. They just need, they're not technology-driven, people-driven, they're capacity-driven, they're policy-driven.
I'd like to add some comment, and now real short. It isn't just that. I'm going to add another element to this. Our capability to build and refurbish and turn things around based upon our supply chain and our industry capability has fallen off. We are not capable of producing as fast as we used to either.
Again, I agree with that, we don't, but some of that is because we've set rules on what you consider parts to fly. The reason we turn parts around is we take parts off the same assembly line that the high-rel parts are, but they aren't certified high-rel, so they take a lot more time. So, again, rules kind of hamstring us. You have to be willing to take risks and break the rules a little. Like I said, we build Class B systems, Angels, which just you already, I know is a system that you all used, we built that in 12 months. We didn't do high-rel parts. So we are in a box that rules make it hard to be innovative.
Afternoon. I can probably shout pretty loud. Sort of Buckley, I'm the exchange officer here at headquarters. My question's for Mr. Barker. Do you think the space traffic management function going to the Department of Commerce is going to be a positive thing for the space catalogue?
Boy, that's a loaded question. No, I don't think that's a good thing. I think it should stay right where it is. I think the Air Force is doing a very good job of collision assessment, and I believe that it probably should stay right where it is.
That was a good question. I was going to ask it, but I was afraid to. Okay. Anybody else have a question?
I started back at the Hampshire Tracking Station in 1968. Folklore I heard back then was that in the early days we had a tracking station at Fort Greely, Alaska, and a tracking station north of Johannesburg, South Africa. Can anybody elaborate on that?
Elaborate on what? What year was that, sir?
I started in 1968. I haven't heard any years on that, but I would think probably early 60s would be my guess on one of those stations that existed.
I came into this system right after the space mission moved into China Mountain, about 1966, 67, and I'm not aware of tracking stations at those locations.
We had stations at Kodiak and Shemya and Madagascar off the east coast of Africa, as well as Hula, one in Hawaii, and one at Vandenberg. But, wasn't there?
Up in Alaska.
Yeah, well,
In New England, too.
Yeah.
We have one in Diabaker, Turkey.
Yeah, I came into to satellite control the same year you did, 68, and I never heard of those.
I know that there was some early work. General Keating, Bill Keating, one of our other pioneers, I think was involved in setting up the South Africa thing. I don't recall what it was for.
I do know one of the things we did, we built a system called TUMAS, remote tracking stations. So we actually could put, for launches, we flew these remote tracking stations called TUMAS, Transportable Mobile Ground Station, to Africa for launches only, and then flew it back. We used to store those in Albuquerque. But I've never heard of a permanent one down there. I mean, it could have been. If Rosie doesn't know, I don't know if they're around.
The job was so classified, I didn't know what I was doing. By the way, I want to make a comment on the question about transferring the catalog. I think my Air Force would be delighted to get rid of what it cost them to do that. I'm not a very happy camper with my Air Force over the years and its lack of supportive space.
Now, there's a web station that's kind of based on the Fort Kodiak tracking station. Some of the comments there did mention some ruins of some antenna facilities at Fort Greely.
You know, I think we had a calibration station at Fort Greely, but I don't think, to my knowledge, that calibration station never uplinked commands. So, again, if Rosie doesn't know, in my mind, it didn't exist.
Very few minutes. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, I'll just try to ask this out loud so we don't take time. And I'm just a civilian, so I don't know anything. But reflecting on kind of corporate America, how they're so good at throwing away their old talent, is there a place for having people that are retired in mentoring roles for overcoming some of these challenges you're talking about?
Well, they're called advisory boards, and I know TAV has served on Defense Science Board Task Force, Air Force Science Advisory Board Task Force. TAV and I both, I chaired a GPS advisory board for many years. There's opportunities through advisory boards for those of us who have graduated to continue to help until the client no longer wants to listen to us.
I also think there are opportunities at the lower level. You know, in LA, at the SPO director, you know, what Rosie and I were on were the centers one, but some leaders come in and say, I want previous help, and so they bring in their previous people as mentors, and there's a capability to have contracts to do that. But it's really the decision of the person running the organization if he wants mentorship or not, and that kind of comes and goes. Same with the review boards, you know, that we're on. People want advice, you know, they ask for it, but they don't always want advice. They want support for what decision they already made. So, but at any rate, I think there's a place for mentoring. I think even if my recommendation to you is even if there's no contractual ability to do that, I think everybody who's been in this business has a responsibility to mentor. So I think once you're retired, I think just going off the grid is okay if you want to retire, but I think there's a place for you to still come and talk to people. And you can participate through organizations like AFA, NDIA, AIA, participate in these things, meet the young kids, and mentor. Because I think it's a responsibility for everybody that's been in this business.
Okay, any other questions? Well, speaking of mentoring, General Rosenberg would like to close today's session with some remarks that I think might be classified as mentoring.
I don't know. I don't know whether it's mentoring or not. And my message is really for the young people in the back of the room and the few in the front of the room in uniform. So the rest of you, please cope with me. Because over 60 years ago, as the Cold War intensified, the world was a really frightening place. That was a time when over 175 years of freedom that our founding fathers fought and died for in the American Revolution were at high risk. The Soviet Union, the evil empire, wanted to destroy our way of life, to either enslave us just as they had done to all of Eastern Europe and their own people by coercive use of military arsenal that was hidden behind an Iron Curtain, or to destroy us with nuclear weapons. Knowing what went on behind that Iron Curtain so we could counter that threat was critical to our survival and making the world safer for my children, my children's children, and yours as well. With the Gary Powers U-2 shoot down, that was no longer possible. All of this led President Eisenhower to direct development of Earth observation and missile warning satellites to lead to National Reconnaissance Program as well as other significant national space capabilities. So for me, it was an opportunity of a lifetime to be part of the space age. We would operate in the new medium of space and would transform the national security environment of the day. Collectively, these efforts turned the tide of the Cold War, enabling us to see, hear, and know with certainty what was going on behind the Iron Curtain, and to develop an awesome combat force to deter and contain the Soviets and help cause the collapse of the Soviet Union, and led to the exceptional space systems of today. Now, Americans look to you, our national security team, to you who serve selflessly, to lead the way to continue that freedom. So my comments really from 60 years of opportunity, service to my country, and a lot of mistakes, what major lessons I learned from leaders I served on do I want to pass on to you, the new generation of leaders? First, ethics and integrity are number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Everything else follows. Ethics and integrity, above all. Focus on the mission. That's what you are here for. Keep your eye on the ball. Make sure what you do is right. Not what the rhetoric or flawed policy, directives, regulations, rules say. If they're wrong, I'll clean up my language. Operate around them. Get the job done and get a job done right. Demand they be changed to do what is right. Maybe that's why I made 2 stars. The mission is not in a regulation book or checklist. The mission is to provide operational capabilities vital to our nation's survival and our freedom. Break down barriers that prevent sensible solutions. Focus on those you serve. Make them understand the right way ahead. Your boss is not always right. Get that? Your boss is wrong a lot of the time. Fortunately, I was lucky to have bosses who tolerated near anarchy from their best troops. Be that to earn their trust and confidence. Be that. It taught me a lesson. Tolerate near anarchy from my best troops, because they knew better than I did. Taught me that lesson. Focus on the future. You're responsible not only for the freedom of your generation, but you're responsible for the freedom of future generations. And as you go up the ladder of rank, good managers only do things right. Good leaders do the right things. Operate outside the box. You must take risk. Followers never fail. But that's part of how you become a leader. I was delighted at lunch to hear General Raymond say that. You must take risk to learn. Better to beg forgiveness than to ask permission to do the right thing. Never ask for permission if you're going to do something outside the box. Go do it. Don't issue orders and expect them to be followed. As a leader, roll up your sleeves, get your fingernails dirty, and lead by doing and showing your troops, not by just issuing orders and expect them to carry them out. Empower your people. They will excel if you do. Make change your baseline. Never be satisfied with the status quo. So what do you need to do? Time for each of you who care about our freedom to TACAMO. It's a Navy expression. Take charge and move out. I'm a boat school graduate. Beat Army, right?
Right.
You must be able to look in the mirror in the morning when you shave or brush your hair and be proud of what you are doing. Never think about what to do to get promoted. Do the above and you will serve your country best. Promotions will follow. Don't ask, what can I do to get promoted? You're useless if you do that. To close, my message to you is to quote John F. Kennedy. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. And that's my message to you young troops back there. I expect to see stars on all of you if you follow those guidelines.
Thank you,
Can I say a
gentlemen.
word quick?
Yes.
That comes from a guy that made colonel in 14 years and brigadier general in 21.
That's all the time, unfortunately, that we have, but you've been a very attentive audience, and I think I and the panelists appreciate that, and you've been good participants as well. I'd like to thank all the panelists for taking the time today to share their experiences with us, and for you, those of you who are family members and have traveled so far to be with them and to hear some of these stories, hopefully some that you've never heard before. And to you, the audience, for your participation today. I'd also like to thank the folks responsible for today's event, particularly Ms. Rosie Cernak and Colonel Betty Bullington, who have come into our office and Mr. Bradley and I would not have been able to do this alone, and so you've been a godsend to us, and we appreciate that. And for the Headquarters Air Force Base Command Protocol Office, and for all the action officers who helped along the way in today's auditorium events, at the luncheon, and all the other things that made this a pleasant experience, hopefully, for you. Thank you so much. That concludes today's Pioneer Discussion Panel. Thank you for your participation. I wish you all a great day. Please stand for the departure of the official party.